Hello, welcome everyone to this year's first edition of a feminist exploration organized by the members of the European Feminist Platform. My name is Neil Datta. I'm the Executive Director of the European Parliamentary Forum for Sexual and Reproductive Rights. And we're here going to be discussing Poland today. So first, a few words about the European Feminist Platform. It is a network in the making, combining the work of feminist scholars, activists, and advocates to collectively fight against the backlash from the far right and to create a strong bond of feminist solidarity all over Europe and beyond. You can find out more about the European Feminist Platform in the link that we will post in the chat room. So we're happy to host this event with the support of the Heinrich-Böll Foundation European Union and the Gunda Werner Institute. Please note that this event will be recorded and you will be able to watch all editions of this series on the YouTube channel of the Heinrich-Böll Foundation. This is going to be a moderated discussion, so please feel free to submit any questions through the Q&A at the bottom of the screen, and we will then discuss them after the input that we will hear shortly. In today's session, we will shed light on the situation in Poland regarding sexual and reproductive health and rights, as well as democracy and the rule of law, with a specific focus on the consequences of the Constitutional Tribunal's decision to ban abortion in cases of fetal anomaly of October 2020. Together with Eliza Rutynowska, we will explore the impact of the verdict on Polish women's access to legal abortion, the reaction from Polish civil society and the general public to the Polish authorities' repressive actions in the face of public contestation. We're very glad to welcome our colleague Eliza Rutynowska. She is a pro bono lawyer for many pro-women's rights and democracy demonstrators and will explain to us how this court fits in with the wider puzzle of the degradation of democracy and rule of law in Poland. So without further ado, I'll turn the floor over to you, Eliza, to take us through the events, the complicated and disturbing events happening in Poland. Eliza, please.
Thank you very much, Neil. And welcome everyone who has decided to spend this afternoon with us. I feel honored to be able to speak to you today, even though through Zoom, but on the other hand, I'm quite happy because that means that many more people can join us rather than if we were meeting at some cafe or other place. So I'm very happy to be here with all of you today. I'm less happy about what is going on in my country, and I am not at all very happy about what I will be explaining to you today. I wanted to start with really getting you into the atmosphere of Poland today. For the longest time, Poland was seen as a winning horse of this race towards democracy, towards improving human rights. After joining the EU, it really, it sped up with its modernization and really became a European state. We started seeing each other more as Europeans rather than only just Poles. And then 2015 hit. It was real to me personally. It was really the first moment when I really realized what politics was about and what everybody says when everybody says that if you're not interested in politics, politics sooner or later will become interested in you. That's when Law and Justice, a conservative populistic party, gained power. Of course, we can always say that, that's the essence of democracy. Sometimes the liberals win. Sometimes, the conservatives win. That's the deal. But democracy, in our view, in the view that we are used to as persons who understand human rights, is meant to mean that it is a ruling of the majority with respect towards minorities. That's the essence of democracy today, of modern democracy, what it should be about. Now, what happened in Poland was completely different. What we were witnessing was a gradual overtaking of institution after institution of the prosecutor's office, an attempt to completely overtake common courts, and which is partially failed, fortunately, because of our common court judges who are still independent. However, the ruling party managed to change and amend the laws so that the Constitutional Court was overtaken and is now politically controlled. The Supreme Court is also so-called overtaken, and an additional chamber was added called the disciplinary chamber, which was meant to discipline judges, prosecutors, and other lawyers. All of this is to show what it means when a populists, not conservatives, populists take over power. But the first thing that they did was overtake the public media. That was their propaganda tube, which is being used very openly till this day. This is all to say, to show you the background of the situation and the seriousness of it. So all in all, let's speed forward to last year when the pandemic hit. Now, once you have a democracy, a functioning democracy, where all the checks and balances are in place, you can be sure, or at least more sure, that once a crisis hits, the government will be taking precautions in accordance to certain set rules. You can be quite sure that it will follow the constitutionally discussed order and, for example, introduce a state of emergency. Now, unfortunately, we entered the pandemic with a populistic government. What does that mean for human rights? Of course, everybody in the world was affected by the pandemic, and everyone had to see somehow their freedoms limited, be it cafes closing down, be it a limitation of gatherings. But again, you can ask, what is the legal basis of those cafes being closed down and the gatherings being limited? What happened in Poland was completely different. Without the introduction of state of emergency, which would allow the government constitutionally to limit certain freedoms and liberties, the government started to act by introducing regulations. Now, regulations within the Polish legal system are the lowest ranking legal acts, just above local laws. And using those regulations, the government decided to completely limit freedom of assembly, to close down specific areas of the economy. And what we ended up with was limitations of our freedoms without a legal basis for that. Of course, that was the take of the lawyers, but that was not the take of the police, nor the prosecutor's office. Why is all of this relevant to women's rights, you may ask? Because once a court decision, I will not call it a judgment due to several formal aspects of it being quite, controversial in terms of legal terms. For example, one of the judges that was behind the ruling on the abortion issue was one of the MPs who signed the initial motion that she later considered as a constitutional tribunal judge. So that's the very first basis on which she should not have been one of the judges to be behind the decision. So once that decision was issued, people took to the streets. But due to the regulations that were put in place, the police decided that all of these assemblies were illegal. And what did the overtaken public TV say? That all of those who were participating in these gatherings were there illegally. Moreover, they were spreading disease. So not only were protesters for women's rights, called out for their feministic views, or called baby killers, or all of the other names that they're used to being called. Right now, they were also being put on public trial, so to speak, for spreading a disease that everybody was suffering from. So that really shows you that we were not only fighting as lawyers for the rights of the protesters. We were not only fighting for women's rights regarding that decision that was passed by the tribunal. We were also combating this narrative that was very widely distributed, not only by the ruling party, but also by the public television and everybody who was close to power. Now, all of this, again, is to show you the atmosphere in which we were placed after the October ruling of 2020. What else happened? Women were, or women's bodies were a battlefield a long time before this decision took place. As you may have heard, one of the first decisions of this government was to restrict the morning after pill for it to be distributed only after a prescription was issued by a doctor. Now, women in Poland, the majority of women in Poland have a problem getting to a gynecologist, a public gynecologist, to obtain even a regular health service, let alone find one quickly enough in order to obtain a prescription for the morning after pill. Now, due to what the government did, that became almost impossible for women to obtain the morning after pill, not only due to the lack of the gynecologists, but also due to the fact that many of them have signed the so-called conscious clause, which meant that they can refrain from giving out a prescription for emergency contraception or performing abortions, for example. Of course, this was questioned by lawyers. Lawyers wanted to limit that conscientious clause solely to the practice of abortion. However, again, this takes time, which Polish women didn't have. The next step of limiting women's rights was also an attack on sexual education in schools. Now, this attack is continuing till this day, and numerous ministers of education are very adamant in saying that they will not let in sexual educators into schools, into high schools, or into any other educational institutions that are under the state's control. For a while, the subject quietened down, and then the first abortion draft bills hit. One of them, of course, claimed that the woman should also be punished for obtaining an abortion. Another said a complete ban on abortion should be put in place. All of them were debated, all of them were protested against, and that's when the umbrella strikes started, the so-called umbrella strikes, because most of them took place in the rain, so most of the photographs that you may see from those strikes will be women carrying umbrellas, and that's why they were called the umbrella strikes. And that's why the umbrella became the symbol for the women's strike. Again, the government took a step backwards. There were so many women on the streets. There was even a strike that was similar to the one done in Iceland years ago, which meant that women decided not to go to work for one day. And this quietened down the topic again. Fast forward to 2020, when you have the pandemic, when you have everyone locked up in their houses, when you have the narrative that if you are going outside gathering, you are spreading the disease, when you have the regulations that are put in place, and even though they're unconstitutional and illegal, they are being executed by the police. And then you have a judgment or a decision being issued that is basically banning 97% of all performed abortions. That really shows you and highlights that this is not a ban on abortion due to fetus abnormality. This is effectively a total ban on abortion in Poland. Now, people, of course, took to the streets, regardless of what the public television said of whether or not they could have been detained by the police. But no one was prepared for what they decided to do and how they decided to address these protests. Again, we still believe that they would not use brute force. They did use brute force. We thought kettling methods, they're not going to use kettling methods, especially in a pandemic. They're not going to crowd people together and not let them leave. They did. They're not going to use batons. They're not going to go after, innocent women armed with what cards and cardboards and words of human rights. They did. They were not going to detain anybody, right? I mean, we were only exercising our right to freedom of assembly. They're not going to go after us for that. They did. They not only went after multiple peaceful protesters. They not only detained them, they not only put them in police cars, they also drove them out from the city to the outskirts. And I'm not talking about 2 kilometers, 3 kilometers, 10 kilometers. I'm not even talking about 20 kilometers. I'm talking about 30 kilometers, 40 kilometers, 50 kilometers from the city center. Now imagine being driven out from a peaceful gathering from the center of the biggest city in your country, 50 kilometers outside, and then left in a police precinct for the night, or even worse, being driven out 30 kilometers and then let out at 3 a.m. in the morning with no way to get back home. That's the reality that we are facing right now in Poland. Now, this is not the end. We are still fighting. We are still on the streets. Lawyers, multiple pro bono lawyers, are taking the backs of the protesters. And we are still at a war with the narrative of what we are truly fighting for. The narrative issue is an extremely important aspect of the fight for human rights. What we have been witnessing for the past 6 years is an attempt to redefine human rights. What we felt were values that were that were already decided. We knew what freedom was. We knew what dignity was. Suddenly, we don't. Suddenly, there's somebody who's telling us that you don't know what dignity is, that dignity does not apply to a pregnant woman. It applies to a fetus. And how will you argue with that? You're not prepared to argue with that because you have a completely different concept of the word dignity. Now, you're going to be going after the EU Charter, for example, fundamental rights. You're going to reach for the European Convention for Human Rights. And they're going to tell you this. Are you a Pole? If you're a Pole, you should be interpreting the Polish law. You should not be reaching out to foreign laws. That is what you would hear. Any sort of attempt to show an international standard, a European standard, is going to be bombarded for being an attempt to introduce foreign and enemy ideals and values into our system. You are going to be placed in the same group of people who are attacking the tradition and people who are attacking a family. Now, you don't want to attack either your country's tradition or families for that matter, but that doesn't matter because you're going to be an actor in that play that is being directed by somebody else. So this really shows you that what we should be really talking about as human rights defenders is how do we protect the already decided definitions of human rights? How do we show that they have not gone out of style, that they do not need to be redefined in any way? They should be protected and they should be guarded. They should not be changed. Now, again, this is a very difficult discussion. However, it's one that we have been forced into by circumstances. And of course, the abortion issue is not a topic that should be discussed in the middle of the pandemic. But this is the moment, which is the best moment for populists to do so. Again, the pandemic lets them say that we're introducing specific measures, we're introducing specific regulations for your own good. We're introducing the limitations of freedom of assembly so that people do not spread the disease in bigger groups. However, the churches are still open. There is no worry there. So this also shows you another thing that we have been witnessing, a dichotomy, a duality of legal consciousness, of different legal worlds that we are right now a part of. We have European courts, and I'm saying this to include both the ECJ and the ECHR, the European Court of Justice and the European Court for Human Rights. We're talking about our common courts, which are standing up for citizens' rights and applying the Constitution directly in specific cases. And then we have the courts that have been overtaken, the Constitutional Court and the Supreme Court now, and the prosecutor's office as well. Now, these are two worlds that are coexisting or are attempting to coexist, but have been created so to create legal chaos within which really citizens are lost. They don't know what's going to happen. Now, for the longest time, they could have reached out to the Ombudsman's office. And the Ombudsman's office was an institution, an independent institution, which was called for by the Constitution in order to protect our human rights and liberties. Now, what happened today? The Constitutional Court decided that it is contrary to the Constitution for the current ombudsman to continue his function after his term ended, even if there is no new ombudsman chosen. Now, what does that mean? That means that Adam Bodnar, our ombudsman, ended his term in September of last year. The ruling coalition did not manage to support any candidate that would have a chance to be also accepted by the Senate, because the candidate for the Polish ombudsman has to be accepted by both the lower chamber and the higher chamber of our parliament. And they refused to support a candidate of the opposition, which meant an independent candidate. So what they decided to do was to remove the current ombudsman, who was an independent ombudsman, from office in order, and that is our anticipation as lawyers, to introduce a position of a so-called acting ombudsman. Now, what does that mean? We are anticipating that this means they will be attempting to amend the law on the ombudsman to introduce a political nominee. Now, if we were set in a courtroom, you would expect to have a defender by your side. Now imagine that the prosecutor sitting across from you decides that he doesn't want you to have a defender, or he wants you to have a defender that he is choosing. That's exactly what's happening to the Polish nation. We have lost our human rights defender, and we have no idea who's going to be taking his place or if somebody will be taking his place. Now, the human rights defender is more than just an empty word or an institution that is not close to the people. I will tell you from practical experience what it means to have the ombudsman interested in what you're doing. When I was at a police station at 2 a.m. in the morning with terrified people who got detained, we had a representative of the National Mechanism for the Prevention of Torture, a body which works within the Ombudsman's office. And that representative arrived, and that representative actually spoke to those who were detained. And then that body, the National National Mechanism for the Prevention of Torture, issued a report of all abuses of power done by the police, committed by the police. So that's how the ombudsman is present in our everyday lives. And that is what's going to be missing very soon. Now, to end my speech, I would like to show you a photograph of what I'm talking about, and something that photograph really speaks volumes of what the last year has been. Now, the person you can see in purple is me at the back, and the person in front of me is Grandma Catherine, Babcia Kasia, one of our biggest heroes of the recent months. A retired person who was extremely active in being at every single more important and less important as well human rights protest. Now, she has been accused multiple times of assaulting a police officer with that rainbow canvas bag that you can see in the photograph. I will end here and pass the floor over back to Neil. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eliza. That was really excellent. I think you've shown us all about how what's happening in Poland is not just about women's rights or abortion rights even, that is really the entry point for a whole unraveling of democracy and the rule of law in the country. And so I think it's really great that you were able to place it in such a much wider perspective, and it opens up the possibility to understand, for those of us to understand the gravity of what's happening in your country. Now, we don't have that many questions yet, so I'd invite all of you who have questions to formulate them in the Q&A, because that's the only way that we can interact on this webinar. So please take a few minutes and ask a few questions. But I have some questions myself. And also, we do have one in there, but maybe I'll abuse my rights as the moderator to ask my question first. And I was wondering, based on what you've just described here, Eliza, I was wondering if you could say a few words about what you think the reaction from the EU has been like. Because as you know, there have been resolutions adopted by the European Parliament. So there's political support at that level. There's rule of law infringement procedures that have started against Poland by the European Commission. Those have only gotten gone so far. So I mean, based on what you've just said, what do you think would be useful or possible from the EU level to help unravel the situation that you've described in Poland, where really, as you pointed out, you're living in a duality of two different legal orders. One, what's emerging in your country, which is very different from the European legal order, which should in fact encompass Poland as well. And yeah, and we're getting questions in, so take a few minutes to answer that, and then we'll get to other questions.
Well, I'd like to answer that with 2 points. Firstly, the positive point, and then the less optimistic one. So, beginning with the good news, the EU has been absolutely phenomenal in giving us a platform, in being a voice for those that are being silenced within their own country. It has stood up for us. It has stood up for human rights. It has flagged numerously the abuses of power, the abuses of human rights in Poland. And for that, we will owe a great thank you. And of course, we do expect and we do hope that the EU will not leave us alone and will continue to flag these abuses of power. It is extremely important that Poland was and continues to be on the agenda. It is extremely important that the Polish representatives or the representatives of the Polish government are being questioned, that they are not left alone to do their will, that their actions are being questioned on the international arena. That being said, I feel like we do have a big problem coming up with, even if we will get judgments that we hope for, or even if the certain procedures that were launched will be pushed forward, will they be respected by the Polish government? That is the biggest question. Because interim measures that have been put in place by the ECJ concerning the disciplinary chamber have not been respected, are not being respected. And nothing is being done about it. So looking at that from that perspective, one thing is what the EU can do and is doing. And the other thing is, and a completely other thing is whether there will be some consequences to it, whether the Polish government will comply with anything. I'll give you an example. It's not only the EU that is standing up, it's also the UN, of course. When we had the Universal Periodic Review back a couple of years back, where there was a recommendation put forward for Poland to broaden the scope of its hate crime laws. The government decided to accept the recommendation. And then when it came back home, so to speak, it openly said that it was not willing to do anything about it. So what did the government do? I'll leave that for everyone to answer that question for themselves. But if I were asked, I would say that was just a blunt lie. So what can the EU do for the government to respect what it's doing? That's the biggest question we're facing today.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Lisa. And we've had quite a few questions coming in about what can be done at EU level. And maybe in relation to this, you didn't touch upon this, but it's been in the media, and it may be good just to have your opinion, although I realize it's probably out of your zone of your field of expertise. But for example, there's been discussions about tying funding coming from the EU to Poland to respect of rule of law. And I think it's last year, Norway decided to suspend its funding to Poland via the European Economic Area instrument because of concerns of rule of law. Do you think that's something worthwhile exploring?
Definitely. We are actually having this discussion right now regarding the COVID, the COVID recovery fund that was put in place last year and is awaiting ratification in member states and in Poland. And the thing is that we're not. So all in all, it's a wonderful idea. And if we were a truly democratic state, we would be very happy for our government to receive those funds. However, we are a para-democratic state at the moment. And once those funds will reach the Polish government, solely the Polish government, without, for example, including local governments as well, we fear that those funds that are meant to upkeep our democracy will be used to basically destroy it even further from the inside out. So definitely linking funds to respecting specific rules, that is the way to go. I mean, if you join a football club, you're not going to get a scholarship if you start drinking. Those are the rules. And if you enter a specific club, you have to follow the rules. And that club has to have the possibility to reinforce those rules. And that's not taking away the independence of a state if it willingly became a member of that club. So definitely, but those mechanisms also have to go hand in hand with a specific narrative, because it will be really easy for the populace to overtake that narrative and show it as a way that, see, the EU is punishing the Poles. Now, it's not punishing the Poles. It should punish the Polish government. There's a difference.
Okay, thank you very much. We've gotten quite a few questions in, so I won't go through them in order. I'm trying to organize them mentally so that we can have a logical sequence. One that comes up that I think would be important to address is if you could say something about the situation regarding the Istanbul Convention, and specific, since I know a little bit about this, if you could say a little bit where the Istanbul Convention specifically stands, and then also that, as you know, that's only 50% of the equation. What is the document that they have in the sidelines to replace the Istanbul Convention? So if you could say a few words about that.
Right. Yeah, so they're not very open about what document they have, cooking up. We are, of course, as human rights lawyers, we're monitoring all of the ideas that are popping up over on the internet. It's different foundations that are working on different documents. And we are anticipating that the Family Rights Convention is the one that will be used as the alternative to the Istanbul Convention. But to put this in more cohesive order. So if there is a draft bill in Parliament which gives the right to, or gives the okay sign for Poland to withdraw from the Istanbul Convention. Now, it also highlights that the Istanbul Convention should be replaced by a document that is, of course, that complies with family values and so on and so on, and traditional values, all of these values that have been flagged as those that are not being respected by the Istanbul Convention. So we feel like there is a document. We don't have an official stand on which document it will be, but it is being flagged that there is one in the making. So what I'm anticipating is an idea to actually reach out to other countries that are also not that friendly with the Istanbul Convention or have doubts regarding the Istanbul Convention. So, we might one day wake up in a reality where we have two Istanbul Conventions, because, once Turkey now withdrew from the Istanbul Convention, I mean, there's nothing stopping Warsaw from reaching out to Turkey again and, creating an Istanbul Convention 2.0.
Yeah. And I think, thank you for that, Eliza. And I think also maybe just to point out that in relation to Turkey, what we're hearing about the Erdogan's announcement to withdraw from the Istanbul Convention, that announcement may itself have been illegal. According to the Turkish constitutional order, the executive should not have the power to make such a decision, which was Turkey ratified the Istanbul Convention unanimously through parliament. And so it's interesting that two anti-women's rights initiatives, such as your Constitutional Tribunal's decision and Turkey's Istanbul Convention withdrawal, could both be technically illegal. So it's an interesting fact. And also maybe to point out that this Family Rights Convention, isn't it largely inspired by what has been called the LGBT-free zones by the European Parliament?
Yeah, so it's sort of a mix of ideas. So there's the attack on human rights is a very broad attack. It uses the same words, it uses the same ideas, it uses the same phrases even. If you take a look at the declarations, you always have the same phrases repeated over and over again, family, traditions, traditional family, for the protection. Once you take, a search kind of box and type in the specific phrases, they're going to be repeated over and over again. So yes, these documents have a tendency to mirror themselves.
Could you say a little bit about who are the engineers behind a lot of this thinking in Poland? Because it doesn't come out of a vacuum. If you could say a few words about who's crafting these documents, who's contributing to the courts, and and to the thinking of the ruling party?
I think there are a lot of actors, those more visible, those who are less visible. Well, firstly, I unfortunately, with a heavy heart, have to concede that the Polish Catholic Church is very active in terms of flagging specific topics that should be understood in a specific way by believers or by parishioners. Churches have unfortunately become a political battleground as well, and a political arena. So that's one actor that I need to name. The second actor being these kind of pop-up NGOs. That's what we call them. So at the beginning of the rule of law and justice, or peace government, what we have seen is another alternative world coming up of alternative NGOs. Now, what do these alternative NGOs really mean? Is that they have the same ideas that the ruling party has, or the authorities have. So they're not watchdog organizations, as NGOs should be. They are more of a lobbyist group, I would say, behind a facade of being an NGO. Now, calling yourself an NGO does not make you one. And that's the biggest worry that we have as other NGOs and think tanks, because they often submit shadow reports even, and those shadow reports reach serious international organizations. And when these organizations look at them, I mean, it's an NGO document. We should also consider it. So that's the second group of actors. And then, of course, there's the third group of actors, political activists. And those but that's the smallest group, I would say. I think that the two main ones are the biggest ones that we have to see.
Yeah. Okay, great, thank you. And maybe sticking with the biggest actor that you mentioned, the Polish Catholic Church, could you say a little bit, this is a question we received from Alison Turner, about why has the church in Poland retained its influence when so many people in other countries have rejected the church for a variety of reasons, including the child abuse cover-ups? And we know that there's been also, like in every country, there's been a big pedophilia scandal in Poland that's really quite recent. So if you could say a few words about this, and how did this play out in Poland?
Yes, it's quite difficult to really explain it quickly. But the position of the Polish Catholic Church has been extremely strong for a couple of hundred years due to our history as well. So Poland has been under the rule of different empires for a very long time, and it has fought a lot of wars. And during that time, the church was always seen as a place of refuge for many of our, the war heroes, the political activists. Also during the communist era, that was the place where the activists would go. Then there was the support of the Polish Pope during the transitional time of the 80s and the 90s. All of this contributed to the power the church has over the Polish society. Now, it's not something that will change very quickly. And, again, over 70% to 80% of Poles declare themselves as practicing Catholics. The numbers are going down significantly from what it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago. But again, there is a difficulty in separating the church as it was seen for hundreds of years to how it is acting today. But if I were to predict the future, or attempt to predict the future, if the church does not back out from this way of acting on the political scene, and this ingration and this attempt at controlling human rights and freedoms, it will lose.
Okay, thank you. We have a few more questions that it would be good if we can get through. So I have one from Andrea Petto, who was saying that, who was questioning a little bit the way you described it at the beginning, saying that the populists sort of came out of nowhere, and that they probably have a longer track record. And the question is, in what sense does this type of interpretation limit the understanding of this, what is a global phenomenon, and also possible ways to develop counter strategies for this?
That's a great question. Of course, they didn't come out of nowhere. They just gained a huge following very quickly. The president that we have now on his second term, President Duda, was a man from nowhere, really. He wasn't known. He wasn't widely known. He was completely created by that one presidential campaign. Now, that's something that you have to understand. The populists didn't come out of nowhere, but they were not the ones who were the faces of who was, of the presidential elections, and then of the parliamentary elections. They decided to go for new faces. That was the biggest surprise. However, they did not come out of nowhere. In Poland, I believe they came out of a very tragic situation, the Smolensk catastrophe. So it was an airplane crash where 96 people were killed, including our former president, his wife, and multiple MPs and members and other very public figures. And on that, the leader of the current governing party built his narrative, and it took him many years to build that narrative. It took him, a significant amount of time, 5 years really, to gain political, power again. First, it was just empathy or sympathy from, the voters, because he lost his twin brother. And then he started to question whether it was really an airplane crash or whether it was an attempt, a terrorist attack. He never said who did it, but it was always there. It was always this, and now it is openly being said that Russians had something to do with it. And of course, if Russians, the biggest enemies of Poland, etc., etc., that's what really drew many people into his cult, so to speak. Now I'm calling this a cult because he created these marches that marched every 10th of every month. And that's how the movement grew. This movement of anti-democracy, of questioning everything that the former government did, and seeing it as an enemy of the true Poles. So that kind of attempt at using empathy grew into nationalism, and nationalism grew into populism, with a hint of nationalism. So of course they didn't come out of nowhere, but again, this kind of shows you how it grows. Now, how to counter it? I would say don't feed into a narrative. Don't feed into a narrative that is extremely dangerous. That is why I'm continuing to kind of highlight that we need to stop this narrative of redefining human rights. We have to stand up for what they truly mean. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I think you've explained that very well, where on the one hand, they did appear suddenly in 2015 when they acceded to power, a bit like what Trump did when he was elected in 2016. But the antecedents which made that happen go back much, much further. And I think perhaps what was a surprise is to many democratic-minded people is that these people could be taken seriously and that they would actually gain power, and that once they do gain power, then that's the agenda would be so damaging that they would not conform to certain of the norms that are expected of democratic governance. but we have a few more questions. One is about the role of Polish civil society in all of this. This is, I think you know very well about that, so it would be great if we could hear a little bit from you about Polish civil society, the women's strike, the other NGOs, and how they've been organizing.
Right. Thank you for that question. It's really close to my heart. Before I became a lawyer for the Civil Development Forum, I was a lawyer at the Polish Society of Anti-Discrimination Law. So an NGO which really tackles one of the most difficult areas of human rights, protection, discrimination, the fight against discrimination. And really the Polish NGOs, the true Polish NGOs, have had an accelerated course at coalition building. So what happened was, whenever a new idea came up that was attacking human rights, that was especially bluntly against human rights and human rights standard, many NGOs decided to come together and create different coalitions. Now, just to give you an example, we have the Committee for the Defense of Justice, and that committee created by different NGOs which tackle the idea of and which fight for the idea of the rule of law, against disciplinary proceedings for independent judges, against disciplinary proceedings for prosecutors. They're ever present at every single hearing of a disciplinary hearing. That's the biggest value that the Polish civil society brings into the game, their presence. Same goes for women's strike. The women's strike was extremely amazing in another sense as well. It activated so many different women all over the country. We had small towns where only one, where it was so well known that even one woman decided to show up for a protest, and that is saying something in a small conservative town in the middle of southern Poland, for example. Now, that was not there before. That kind of courage that the civil society brought into play, it is quite amazing to see.
Okay, great, thank you. That's very inspiring, Lisa. Thank you. We're near the end of our session, but there's still a few more questions that would be great if you could address. One of them, very briefly, it's perhaps a bit of a complex question to raise near the end, but there's one here about if there's any flaws in the Polish legal system or constitution that allowed the PIS government to capture the courts so quickly, and then on the one hand, so the flaws with any potential flaws on the Polish judicial system, and then separately, if you have any thoughts on the possible strategies that we should be following at EU level or Council of Europe level in order to help the situation in Poland.
It's a great question that I have been asking myself for the past 6 years, and trying to find those flaws. But in all seriousness, there's this Latin saying that all laws fall silent when the arms raise up. Arms meaning guns and swords and what have you not. And unfortunately, that's what happened here. To put it bluntly, we are lawyers with our laws, with our provisions, with our written constitution. And on the other hand, we have a baseball bat that is basically, swiping everybody out of the picture. Of course, you can say that the Constitution was not as precise as it should have been, but that's the meaning of the Constitution. A Constitution cannot be precise to the point, because it has to give a realm of possibilities for the changing of times. The Constitution stays very, very stable, and it ensures the stability of the state. However, laws have to be sometimes changed, but the Constitution does give specific conditions, such as Poland is a democratic state of law, and under that there is an entire world of what it means to be a democratic state of law. There is Article 7, which says explicitly that our authorities have to act within the written boundaries, within the written provisions. And they have broken those laws. They have broken those regulations. They have broken these rules that have been put in place by the Constitution. So the Constitution cannot be, 3,000 pages long, including every single possible scenario that can come up. But it does have specific rules that the government has to follow. Now, what can be done to protect us? Of course, we have been, as lawyers, looking at different possibilities to improve the checks and balances approach of specific, provisions at least. But again, all the legal acts that we can put in place can be changed by different legal acts. So unless the governing powers decide to comply with the Constitution, we will always be at the losing end because, again, laws force silent in the face of arms.
Okay, thank you for that. And instead of the wrapping up, because I don't think I can do justice to what you've very elegantly expressed today, maybe the best way of wrapping up now would be to address one of the two questions that we've received, which are specifically maybe to hear from you parting words about that you can communicate to the over 80 people that have joined this webinar today. Who all want to help in some way about what's happening in Poland. So what would be your suggestions for what the international community can do, and also specifically what role can feminists play in helping the situation in Poland?
Thank you for that question. Firstly, I would see it similarly to how I see what the EU can do. Continue to give a platform and to raise voices of those who are falling silent, or to those who are voiceless in Poland, or those who are being persecuted. That is the biggest, that is what the international community can say, can be our voice, because that's what populists are afraid of. They're okay with being left alone to do what they're bidding in their will. And don't leave them alone to do that. Don't leave them to do whatever they want to do. Because again, something that I always say, one populist's plan is a blueprint for a different populist. And now today we're talking about Poland. Tomorrow we may be talking about Hungary. In a few days' time, we may be talking about your country. You never know when it's going to hit you. And what can feminists do? I think that feminists, especially, knowing what it means to be discriminated, knowing what human rights mean, stand up for what those human rights mean, teach other people about what those human rights mean and their true meaning, not the one that is being forced on us by specific groups, and do not allow for a redefinition of human rights.
Okay. So thank you very much, Eliza. That's really great. That's very practical, that's very practical suggestions, and it helps everyone keep a clear mind about what they can be doing in relation to Poland. I think we'll wrap up now, so we're exactly on time. So thank you so much. I can imagine you've been grilled now for half an hour after presenting the situation in your country. So thank you very much for making time to join us. Thank you to everyone who's participated in this webinar. And just as a reminder, if this webinar will be made available on the YouTube channel of the Heinrich-Böll Foundation European Union, and so I think everyone who signed up for it will receive a link to be able to view it at your ease. And at least hopefully, when you were suggesting that to give a platform to advocates from Poland, I'm hoping we were able to contribute in our own modest way by inviting you to speak at this webinar. So thank you very much. And as we say in French, Eliza, bon courage, keep up the good fight, and we'll be in touch again in the very near future. So thank you all, and we'll wrap up for now.
Thank you.